The Vandenreich launches a full-scale invasion into Hueco Mundo, toppling their leader and conquering the land, while Neliel falls from the sky, desperately asking Ichigo for help, and at the same time, the Soul Society comes together and mourns for their fallen dead. All this and more takes place within episode 2 of Bleach the 1000-Year Blood War, titled Foundation Stones. With this episode, we're going to start doing things slightly differently. Moving forwards, we'll be covering the anime with 2 videos a week. First and foremost will be a live reaction video, and I've already done one for this week's episode that you can check out now, and then that video will be followed up by an in-depth spoiler analysis and review discussion, complete with comparisons to the source material. The first week of the anime's release was something of a trial period, and I really appreciate all of your support on the videos I uploaded. And as for moving from 3 anime videos a week to 2, my reasoning behind that decision was actually quite simple. Basically, I want to free up extra time within the week for more of my usual analysis and discussion style videos that I don't want to leave by the wayside while trying to cover the anime as best as possible. I think this is the best compromise, the best way of going about this, but of course I'd love to hear your thoughts on this approach in the comments below. But for the foreseeable future, I think this is how we'll be handling things on the channel. And before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you wanted to take that support another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And to all the patrons supporting me over there, I really do appreciate it. Thank you guys so very much for your support. And of course, as mentioned in the title, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc in the review to come. So, episode 2, Foundation Stones, how does it stack up to episode 1? To cut a long story short, I really enjoyed it, and I think in many ways it's actually superior to the blood warfare that came before it. Obviously, I loved episode 1. I confessed that I was reviewing it, that I was scoring it, really through the lens of pure excitement and just hype that Bleach was back. So episode 2, being viewed through a more critical gaze, I think had a lot to live up to, and as far as I'm concerned, it actually succeeded and in many ways was the better episode of the 2, and I think that's because primarily we're now diving deep into the meat of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. We're getting to the really exciting parts of the story already where things are starting to get kicked up into high gear. New characters are being introduced that I couldn't wait to see, new battles and scenarios are beginning to ramp up, and basically the stakes are suddenly elevated even higher than they were last week. But what chapters is this new episode covering? Well, as I predicted last week, they're actually covering a little bit less than they did in the premiere. The first episode covered 5 chapters total, which I did think was a pretty mammoth amount, whereas this episode is now only covering 4. Still a good chunk of story, still the pacing does feel a little bit off, it's very, very quick still, but overall I think this episode does a better job under that weight and it manages it a little bit better. The chapters this episode covers are 485, Foundation Stones, the name of the episode, 486, The Crimson Cremation, 487, Breathe But Blind, and 488, Bond Behind Blast. Again, that's a great chunk of chapters covered in one episode, and as they did with the last one, that does come with some sacrifices. There is cut content abound in this week's episode, some of which is more egregious than others. A lot of the time it seems like they are generally cutting comic relief, superfluous fluff, which I really don't mind too much as far as I'm concerned. If they want to keep up the darker, more mature tone of the 1000-Year Blood War, I've got no issue with that. It's when they cut more important elements, as we'll see later on, that I start to get a little bit concerned. Still no word on that Vizard scene from last week, so someone in the comments mentioned, what if they're cutting the Vizard plotline entirely? And that gave me a little flutter for a minute, as I was a little concerned as to whether or not that might actually be happening, but I'm hopeful that they will include it later on down the line. Before we talk about any of that sort of thing though, let's discuss that new Bleach opening. Frankly, I adore it. It's basically everything I wanted from a new Bleach opening. Like I said in my live reaction, I am a little bit basic when it comes to that sort of thing. I just want to see the good guys fighting the bad guys with some absolutely stunningly fluid animation, and we totally get that. And actually, as far as I'm concerned, no hyperbole here whatsoever. I think this could be the most stylish Bleach opening we have ever had. That shock of pink in the background goes so well with contrasting everything else. I absolutely love how it looks. However, we have to address that the opening is quite spoilerific. Now, obviously, we've all read the manga, that's why we're here in this video, so for most of us it was cool references and, oh, look at that moment they're actually showing us in the opening, but there are some real, genuine spoilers here for people who haven't read the story yet. Now, Bleach has had spoilery openings in the past. One that comes to mind immediately is opening 12, which literally spoiled the release forms of all the Espada that had yet to fight at that point in time. Characters like Stark, Baragon, Harribel, Yami had their resurrections totally spoiled in that opening. And the same kind of goes here, although honestly I think this opening is a mix of outright spoilers and slight more hints towards events to come. If we begin with what I think is the most overt spoiler, they actually show that Uryu is a member of the Sternritter in this opening, along with showing every single Sternritter, and it feels maybe a little early for that, especially since the image they are using for reference here is a colour page spread from chapter 640. This was right near the end of the series, so obviously we had seen every Sternritter by now. We were well entrenched into the Uryu is a traitor subplot. But this is brand new, this is episode 2. So if an anime-only person sees that, and Uryu is front and centre in that image as well, it's going to be pretty obvious what's actually going down. Other elements that I'm not sure are so much direct spoilers, but they come dangerously close, I think, is basically everything regarding Ichigo and his new Zanpakuto. That plays a heavy role in this first opening, which I guess I'm not surprised by. But they show, for instance, Ichigo taking the hand of White. We see his Zanpakuto spirit complete with Hollow Mask and everything like that once Ichigo finally understands the truth of who he is. We see a lovely transition of Zangetsu going into Yuha Bark, which is potentially a massive spoiler if someone who's an anime-only viewer manages to work that out. That's so massive that I ranked that as the second most shocking plot twist of all time in Bleach. So I think they're playing with fire a little bit there, although that transition is absolutely lovely. And another pretty crazy spoiler, although again, it's difficult to really call it a spoiler, and they only flash up for like a second, and they're also quite shadowed as well, so you don't really see them, but you do see the Zero Division very briefly, which I think is awesome. I love the way their crest is like painted on the stairs, and they're in it so fleetingly that it's difficult to call it a spoiler. It's also really awesome to see them, as this is the first time we've ever actually seen them in the form of this new anime. So I'd say they were probably the biggest spoilers. In regards to things I'm surprised they didn't show, I'm really surprised there was nothing about young Ishin or Masaki in this opening whatsoever. It kind of makes me wonder where this season is going to end. If they're talking about Ichigo's true Zanpakuto, which they show at the end of this trailer, that's also another spoiler that I just remembered, they literally show his brand new Zanpakuto at the end, then we must get to see Ishin and Masaki sooner rather than later. So I'm really surprised that wasn't in there. But actually regarding this opening, I just think it's so lovely. It's so beautiful. A really lovely little detail is when you see each division of the Gotei 13, they are accompanied by that division's flower, that division's insignia. That is so nice to see. And then when you see Ichigo with his Zanpakuto spirit, he is surrounded by his own field of flowers, except in this instance they are Asauchi that he is training against in the Royal Palace. So that sort of thing is so great to see. I love how dynamic it is. I love that we get to see the Bankai stealing fights. Renji and Byakuya going up against Az, Komamura against Bambietta, Soifon against BG9, Toshiro against Kangdu. There's even a brief snippet of Kyoraku taking on Robert, deflecting his bullets. A lovely transition from Kyoraku's face to Yamamoto's, perhaps heralding that he becomes the Captain Commander. And then, of course, presumably Yamamoto's Bankai being teased at the end there as well. It's pretty much everything I wanted. Like, it pretty much is everything I wanted. I think it looks so good. That final standoff between Ichigo and Yuha Buck is so dynamic. In general, I think the opening is absolutely fantastic. So if we get into the actual meat and potatoes of the episode itself, I was completely wrong with my predictions last week. I thought that they might start us off with Sasakibe's funeral, but no, they go straight into the start of 485 with the Yuha and Luda's Freegan conversation, and it's pretty much done one for one, and I have to say I absolutely loved it. Really some creative shots here. I love that initial spin where we see that Yuha is actually a reflection in Luda's blood. That was so cool. And again, the uncensored nature of this anime means that in some aspects it's actually more gory, more gruesome than the canon manga was. Luda's does not have anywhere near that much blood on the floor when he has lost his arm. And again, I think it's almost a comical amount, but it's pretty effective. And that really sinister music that plays as well when Yuha is talking, I think is just perfect. I actually loved that scene, to the point where I was glued to it from the moment the episode began. I was like, this is really good. They are absolutely nailing this. That, again, that they are using like a brass band for the Vandenreich that is so perfect, and they're doing a really good job of encapsulating how terrifying these people are, whether it's the creepy icy blue mood lighting, or that blaring horn that plays when there's that horrifying close-up on Eburn's eye as he basically knows they are going to die. I think it's so very well done. I love all of that. The start of this episode I thought was absolutely fantastic, and also, like I said, very close to the canon manga. This moment with Yuki and Shino is slightly changed. They totally removed the gag about Yuki having Shino humming as his ringtone on his soul phone. I don't mind that that is gone, and actually it's not the first time they've removed comic relief moments with these two characters. Clearly they see them as being mostly superfluous fluff, and I tend to agree. So I'm not too disappointed that that moment is gone. However, the next part with Yuki answering the phone talking to Akon about Sasakibe's death has been altered ever so slightly. Akon mentions, of course, that Sasakibe has died, and Shino comes in and says, Sasakibe, isn't he the guy who was serving Yamamoto for like 1,000 years? How could someone like that have been killed? That line is not in the canon manga at all, and I think that's actually quite interesting based on what they remove later on from this episode, and I can't help but thinking, basically the fact they get rid of Byakuya's eulogy for Sasakibe, a part of me wonders if this single throwaway line by Shino is supposed to be some kind of a replacement for that. Honestly, I kind of hope not, because I really liked that funeral scene in the manga, and I don't think they do it 100% justice here, but we'll get to that in a minute. But this moment, other than that line, is again pretty similar. Like I said from one of the trailers earlier, we actually get to see a shot of the destroyed gate and all the dead Shinigami around it where Driscoll attacked. That's a really nice little detail. Once again, though, no fight for Sasakibe. There is one final chance for them to show us that battle in the form of a flashback when Driscoll is using his Bankai, but I'll be honest, I'm not holding my breath at this point. There are some nice new reflective scenes of everyone kind of taking in the knowledge that Sasakibe has been killed, that Soul Society came under attack. That's where that shot of Chad going for a run comes from. That's where the shot of Uryu pondering his Quincy cross comes from. Clearly he's starting to think maybe the Quincy are actually behind all this, but it's nice. It gives us a moment to let it sink in that Sasakibe has died, and that it also affects the Karakura Town gang as well. Then, of course, we get the arrival of Nell, who hasn't been seen in the story for an extremely long time. Again, this is pretty faithful to the source material itself. She falls from the sky, except this time we can actually see the Garganta that she comes through. She lands on Ichigo, the two of them talk briefly. Like I said in my trailer review, I actually think this moment is probably better and more impactful in the anime. Although it plays out basically exactly the same, being able to hear Nell's voice, the fact that she is normally used for comic relief and that she arrives as comic relief, but then it very quickly changes and becomes very sinister when she is just kind of weeping in Ichigo's lap and she's like, Hueco Mundo is, you have to help me. And it's really sinister actually hearing her crying about it. That made that moment a lot more powerful for me. And of course, after this, we get the continuation of the Yuha Luda's Freegan scene. Again, it's really, really good. They do the angles of Yuha really well. I expressed some concerns when the trailers were coming out that Yuha was looking too small, too scrawny, because he's supposed to be hulking. He's supposed to be absolutely massive and demand screen presence whenever he's around. I'm not entirely sure they've nailed that just yet, but they're trying. Like, he fills up the entire screen on numerous occasions, which is definitely a stylistic choice to make him appear absolutely massive. Of course, he destroys Ludus's head, which again is like so gruesome. I think it's fantastic, to be honest. He just blows his head away, and then Ludus's corpse is just in front of Eburn on the floor. Poor old Eburn. Eburn's a great character for as small amount of time as he's around. And a very tiny little detail here is that Yuhabak pops his head like he does with Ludus, and Eburn's head just explodes. In the manga, however, that's not quite what happens. Yuhabak just decapitates him somehow, because we can see Eburn's head on the floor when Hashwolf picks up his medallion. One of the Vandenreich soldiers then begins to talk to Yuhabak about how, are we sure it's not a waste killing these well-trained Urankar soldiers? I think something interesting is going on here, but I'm not entirely sure, and we'll get into this in a little bit. But for now, I want to say that I absolutely love seeing Yuhabak breaking down his throne, turning it into stairs. That's a great moment, where he goes to his, like I said in my live reaction, contextually random prison of Harribel up in the sky somewhere with just a curtain in front of her. But again, I think it's handled well. I think it's really creepy. The music that plays, that it's like a twisted violin or something that plays when Yuhabak reveals her with this evil grin on his face about how he's conquered Hueco Mundo. Really awesome. Just creepy, just really jarring, and I think it's done really well. With the arrival of Pesce into Karakura Town, we move now into 486, and unlike 485, this chapter is changed a lot more than the previous one. Sasakibe's funeral will perhaps be the most controversial part of this episode, I think. And I think the changes to the funeral come with both good and bad aspects to them. First of all, the good. I think the funeral feels like a much bigger affair. I absolutely love that they are beating the drum, that every important Shinigami is here. Firstly, it makes for a great visual spectacle, but it also just makes a lot of sense. If I'm remembering rightly, during this moment in the manga, it's basically just Yamamoto, Byakuya Renji, because Byakuya is reading the eulogy, and a couple of other characters, and that's literally about it. I guess it could be seen that Yamamoto wanted it to be a private affair, whereas that has been totally flipped on its head now in the anime, where it feels like a much bigger deal. But I think there are benefits to both approaches here. Another thing I really like about this is the lighting. I love that kind of somber, very like sunset look to everything. Now for the moments I don't think do work that well. They completely remove Byakuya's eulogy for Sasakibe, and I think that's a really weird choice. Now, a lot of people in the comments last week were saying it doesn't really matter that they've cut down Sasakibe's scenes because no one cares about Sasakibe. You're not wrong. No one cares about Sasakibe, and basically I will say that that is absolutely accurate, but that's not the point. The point is, these scenes are not for Sasakibe, they are for Yamamoto. It's all about Yamamoto's character development, his downfall. At this point in the story, he is supposed to start spiraling rapidly off the rails because he has lost his dear confidant. And I think robbing us of Byakuya's words where he says things like, us mere peons cannot possibly understand the level of grief that our Captain Commander feels at this moment, coupling that with removing one of the best panels of Yamamoto that Kubo has ever drawn, where he is just standing there looking completely despondent, is a real shame. And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't get across that same level of grief that we feel in the manga for Yamamoto. So that's a shame. I'm hoping maybe some of Sasakibe's eulogy will be repurposed later on down the line, perhaps as part of his flashback. If we even still get the flashback, I'm pretty sure we will. So for me, that's definitely a bit of a shame. And it does feel like this scene was kind of sped through, perhaps at the expense of that real emotion at the centre of it. There was a really nice part where Yamamoto remembers Sasakibe kind of kneeling before him. That was really nice. But there was no reason, I don't think, why Byakuya couldn't have been talking over the top of that. Not only does that scene work for Yamamoto, but it's also a nice piece of world building because Byakuya and his family are the, essentially, historians of Soul Society. So that is why he would be the one giving the eulogy. So again, I think a little bit was lost there because of that. When we come back to Ichigo and the gang back in Ichigo's bedroom as they kind of plan their next move after finding out about Hueco Mundo's fate. Again, a couple of small moments are removed here. Some comic relief featuring Nell when she doesn't remember who Chad is, but also perhaps more importantly, Ichigo realizing Eburn was a captured Arrancar forced into the service of the Vandenreich. Again, it's a really small moment that's not super important, but it would have been nice for continuity's sake for Ichigo to have picked up on that when he was told what was going on there, basically. Of course, I can't complain too much, because presumably this is all in service of the absolutely phenomenal new scene that was added. Back when one of the earlier trailers came out, we speculated that Yhwach, when he was floating in midair above the Quincy's with all that power coming off of his hands, I speculated that that was going to be showing us the invasion of Hueco Mundo, and that is exactly what is going on here. I think this is awesome. It's so very good. Now, there's not really any action in this scene. The fighting has, for the most part, already finished, but it's still considerably more than we get in the source material itself. It is imposing, it is terrifying, the music is awesome again, that kind of beating drum, the Vandenreich marching forwards like this terrifying, faceless oppressor, the shadows of all the soldat moving beneath their master. Hueco Mundo just devastated, Harribel pinned against this wall, blood running down her face. It looks like chunks of like her leg are missing as well. And it really serves to humanize Hueco Mundo. It's really well done. Neliel is horrified at what has happened to their queen, and Harribel with her last breath tells them to run. She says, run, get out of here. And it's brilliant. It is basically everything I wanted. Now, maybe I'd have liked to have seen Harribel actually try and fight Yhwach, but you can't have everything. I'm just grateful we got this, because I think it is necessary to actually see Hueco Mundo being bested in this way. Couple of interesting points here. Does Harribel know who Nell actually is or not? Maybe not, or maybe she does. Also, I'm guessing it's just for convenience's sake, but were they actually hanging out together, or did they come together to fight off the Vandenreich? It's difficult to know exactly. And because we actually see Yhwach teleport her away inside the shadows, it makes me wonder if they are planning on returning to her subplot or not. Because it would be really weird to add this extra focus if you are then just going to completely ignore her like the manga did. So I'm really optimistic about this scene. This is the kind of addition that I want to see. I love this sort of thing, because this is a plot beat that we didn't see in the manga and we are seeing it now. And also Harribel actually gets a line now, thanks to this scene. So, as you can tell, I loved this. I think it is so sinister, it's so imposing, and you just get the sense that Hueco Mundo was completely helpless, and I love it. I think it's fantastic, and I hope for more of this sort of thing in the future. I think the key thing with this scene is that you can really feel Yhwach's power, his tremendous power, greater than anything else around in that moment. Even though he doesn't really do anything outside of float there ominously, it still works. It still comes across perfectly, in my opinion. And yeah, I really did love that moment. There's a nice new sentence from Uryu where he begins to seemingly tell Ichigo that he is starting to think that Quincy might be the new enemy, but of course he's cut off by the arrival of Kisuke, who, as I mentioned in my live reaction, I don't know what it was about his voice, but just hearing it was so nostalgic. As we come to the end of 486, the introductory scene for Hashwolf was handled weirdly here, I thought. It seemed unnecessarily truncated. Firstly, they actually decided to hide his face here, which they don't do in the manga in this scene at all, which again I thought was a little bit weird. And something else that's really intriguing to me is that he is now wearing the normal uniform of a Sternritter, whereas originally we were supposed to think he was part of that advanced guard that went with Ludas to confront Yamamoto. As in the source material, when he speaks to Yhwach, he is wearing that outfit that they are all wearing. He has his black visor now on his shoulder, and it seems pretty clear he was the one talking to Yhwach about how, he shouldn't be wasting Arrancar and all that sort of thing. It feels like, to me, the anime is going for a slightly different approach. It almost feels like they are trying to tell us that Hashwolf wasn't a part of that guard. He's wearing totally different clothing, and I don't think it sounds like, I could be wrong because I'm not sure, but I don't think it sounds like the same person who is talking to Yhwach from beneath that mask as we then hear Hashwolf's voice later on. Now, I could be completely wrong, but it does sound a little different to me. So while I can't be sure, it does feel like they are trying to distinguish Hashwolf from the rest of that group, which would honestly make so much sense. That's the sort of thing that I would be absolutely fine with, because it never made sense to me that Ludas was strutting in front of Hashwolf to begin with. That makes no sense whatsoever. So for me, I would be totally fine if it was like later revealed that that group was just a group of Arrancar who were sent out because they were expendable, and, you know, Yhwach wouldn't have minded if Yamamoto had roasted them. Another thing that's weird about this scene is that in the manga, in this scene, Hashwolf picks up Eburn's medallion and he says, you know, I wasn't able to capture Ichigo Kurosaki's Bankai, but they totally skip over all of that in the anime, and I wonder if they're still just trying to really keep it a secret what these medallions actually do. As we begin 487 and the gang makes their way to Hueco Mundo, the Garganta has a brand new look on the inside, which I kind of like. It threw me off a little bit. It's a bit weird on the eyes, I think, especially when combined with the bright orange of that Reiatsu bridge, but on the whole, I think it's fine. Again, once the gang arrives in Hueco Mundo, they cut some of the comedic moments, Ichigo trying to cover Pesce's mouth and failing, that's completely gone here, and instead is replaced with a really nice and atmospheric look at the destruction of Hueco Mundo. Going into this episode, I wasn't sure how I would feel about that green hue that's been placed over everything, but actually I think it works pretty well. Hueco Mundo is supposed to be basically pitch black after all. There wouldn't really be a normal source of light outside of the moon. So actually, I think the way it looks is pretty cool. I actually do quite like it. I especially love the new soundtrack in this scene. I think it's so good at setting that scene. But again, for the most part, it's pretty similar to how it is in the manga. Orihime using her fairies to check the bodies to see if anyone is still alive. Ichigo rushing to not only save Dondachaka, but as many Arrancar as he can. And of course, Chad talking to Pesce and Urahara saying that you came to us because you knew Ichigo would act this way. That's all the same as it is in the manga itself. And then of course we get the part that I was probably looking forward to the most, the introduction of one of the major new bad guys, Sternritter J, the Jail, Kirige Opie. Now, Kirige is given a title card in this scene, which I think makes sense. He has one in the manga as well, but he is not revealed to be a Sternritter or have his epithet revealed until basically before he dies, where he mentions that he is Kirige Opie J of the Jail. I think it makes a lot of sense that he's brought up as a Sternritter here. It's kind of funny though, because the Sternritter haven't actually been officially mentioned at all yet. That will be next episode when Yhwach says, you know, gather the Sternritter, summon the Sternritter to the Gate of the Sun. So it's kind of weird that he is given this title card, because an anime-only viewer who somehow does not know what the Sternritter are would be like, what the hell does that mean? But of course the jail isn't revealed yet, which I think is obviously crucial. I actually think the sequence where Kirige kills the Arrancar, where he lines them up and begins stabbing them, is probably better here than it is in the manga. I think being able to see them lined up like that and then him pushing his spear through them one by one is more effective here in motion. And I really do love the scene where Loli and Menoli attempt to attack him. The animation is really smooth. I love the way they move out the way so that he strikes their chains, then they cut his spear in half. That all looks absolutely fantastic. And of course it's great to see these two characters again, albeit for a very short time. Of course, Kirige defeats them in basically the exact same way he does in the manga. They're actually missing a line here though. When they draw their weapons on him, Kirige says, I thought we confiscated all their blades, to which one of his men replies they must have been hiding them somewhere. That line is no longer in the anime, and I always used to think that was a reference to Yami wondering where Loli hid her dagger in her outfit, so I always thought that was kind of a cool callback. So it's a little bit of a shame to see it gone here. One small thing I found to be kind of interesting here is that when Kirige fights back, when he basically destroys Menoli's sword, you can see in his other hand he has generated small arrow-like daggers which he then throws into Menoli's shoulder. Again, it's nice animation, it happens really fast and fluidly, and it shows you how quick he actually is. But this is not how I thought this happened in the manga itself. We know from later chapters that Kirige's bow is essentially his sword. He can hold his sword out and it will generate arrows alongside it. So I always imagined that basically when he swung his sword at Menoli, he was also throwing arrows at her from his blade that then embedded themselves in her shoulder. It's not a huge deal, but it kind of just changes the dynamic of this scene a little bit because Kirige is not attacking them in the way I thought he was. Him summoning the little daggers is actually pretty cool as well. but a part of me prefers the idea of him almost lackadaisically just unsheathing his blade and striking her with arrows at the exact same time. Regardless though, for the most part, this is exactly the same. When the Trebestia arrive and attack Kyoruge's men to defend their home, again there is some wonderful animation that signals their arrival, almost jarringly good. Like, it's so much better than almost everything else in the episode when Apache's weapon goes flying around, destroying the bodies of these Quincy. It just is so good. It looks amazing. It's frenetic. It's chaotic. And it all happens so fast, and it just, again, feels a little bit jarring. But it's really cool to see them here. They arrive on the scene, again, in basically the same way they do in the source material. Neliel gives us a bit of exposition about these characters, along with some flashbacks to the old anime, which I did find very nostalgic to see. The actual battle between the Trebestia and Kyoruge and his men happens slightly differently here to how it does in the source material. For the most part, it's effectively the same thing. Apache and Milo Rose begin attacking the men straight away. There's a nice moment where Apache kind of like sneezes a Sero, which I thought was really cool, and especially since you don't really see too many Sero anymore in this arc, that was nice. And the Sero sound effect is as awesome as ever. But in the manga, Sun joins them in fighting off his men, but here, Kyoruge is kind of just observing them from the side, and she appears behind him to try and attack him, which I thought was really good. That makes total sense to me. Why would they just leave him there? And there's a great moment where she's trying to strike him, and he's basically laying out his proposal for them while he's being attacked. He's saying, you know, you should surrender immediately. You ladies are very strong. I'd rather have you join our army than have to kill you. At which point Milo Rose attacks him, and then he says, you know, if you join us, you can work with your beloved Tia Harribel, and I can't imagine any greater happiness for you now or ever. This scene, again, is handled differently in the manga, basically. The Trebestias are kind of left to their own devices to fight and destroy Kyoruge's men until one of them runs away and he's like, we need backup, we need to order a retreat, at which point Kyoruge just kind of like blasts him through the chest and kills him. I like both approaches, that's the difficulty here. There are things I prefer about each one. The manga is more sinister, I think, because it puts a halt on the fighting the moment Kyoruge kills his own man. The Trebestia all kind of stop and look at him and allow him the floor, basically. And you get this really lovely moment where he goes on about his spiel about how they should join the Vandenreich because they're wonderful warriors. They basically says, don't underestimate us. At which point Kyoruge is like, oh, I see, negotiations have broken down. How disappointing. And it's really sinister because the focus is on him. You don't quite get that with them talking to him while fighting him, but at the same time, it does work really well. And they do have that nice moment where the Trebestia are like, you know, don't underestimate us. And Kyoruge basically takes that to mean, okay, I'm going to take you all out. Now, as for the Gotei 13's captains meeting, this is an interesting scene, and I imagine they will be carrying this scene on next week. Basically, in service of the ending of this episode, they chop it up a little bit, and I actually think it works extremely well. I think this is another instance of the anime's structure changing that works perfectly here. So basically at the very start of this meeting, Mayuri reveals to everyone around that yes, the Vandenreich, the rebels, are actually Quincy. And basically in the manga, this just carries on. After he says that, you get a slight reaction shot from all the captains, and then Yamamoto steps in, and this is where we get all the stuff about his grief, him wanting to just destroy these enemies. They don't do that in the anime. Basically, Mayuri comes in, he says, you know, oh, the Vandenreich, the ability to totally destroy a Konpaku, it only belongs to one race. And Ichigo arrives on the scene of the Trebestia's defeat, and Kyoruge turns to look at him, and it is so creepy and so sinister as Mayuri finishes saying, they are Quincy's. That is perfect. Excellent way to cliffhanger an episode. It's a brilliant way to finish things off. It makes sense as well. You end the second episode by finally actually confirming that the villains are Quincy's. I think this works better here than it does in the manga. The Quincy reveal was always really weird in the manga, I think, because we kind of knew it was them anyway, and I guess the same is true for the anime, but it felt like they were revealed to be Quincy at least 3 different times, and therefore it didn't really have that same impact. It was revealed when Eburn revealed his Quincy cross, it was revealed by Mayuri in this captain's meeting, and then it was revealed later again when Ichigo says, are you really Quincy's? And Kyoruge says, yes, we are the Quincy's you know so well. I think this is better. Putting it right at the end here, having Mayuri say that they are Quincy, having Kyoruge look so evil as it's revealed, great setup for next week, and it did end where I thought it would as well. But of course, because we cut that part of the captain's meeting, there's an entire conversation to be had with Yamamoto, and that's probably going to happen next week, since we actually get to see that shot of Yamamoto kind of declaring war on the Vandenreich in one of the trailers. So that's obviously coming in the next episode, March of the Starcross. And that's pretty much it for the episode. Like I said, I think it's great. I love the way it dives right in to the meat of the story. We get to meet these brand new characters. Kirige Opie is fantastic, the standout character in my opinion for this week. I think his voice actor did a brilliant job bringing this pompous, arrogant, windbag of a character to life who is totally authoritarian, but also like flamboyant at the same time. I think he's fantastic. I love seeing him brought to life. As I mentioned in the live reaction, it's the weirdest part for me is now actually getting to see the Sternritter. That's the weirdest part. As for some predictions for next week, I was basically entirely wrong regarding the structure of this episode, but I was correct when I said where it would end and what the title of the next episode would be. This time, I actually think that they will once again adapt 5 chapters, because to me, it feels like the most natural ending for an episode is the end of chapter 493, which ends with Yhwach saying conflict is a bitter affair, as the Pillars of Blue Flame arrive in Soul Society. That feels like the most natural cliffhanger to me. Chapter 489, which should theoretically be the first scene of episode 3, is actually a vice captain's meeting, which is the first time we see characters like Rukia and Renji in this arc. But I can't help but wonder if this vice captain scene will either be completely cut or really cut down to size in order to save time, especially if they aren't too bothered about this whole disappearing Rukongai citizen plot. So yeah, next week I think we will cover 5 chapters. It sounds like a lot of content, but also bear in mind that a lot of those chapters are basically just the fight between Ichigo and Kirige, as well as the arrival of characters like Aion. So there's a big battle to be had next week, which I think should be really exciting. And it's also why I don't think they will have such an issue adapting so many chapters, because the fight chapters in particular can generally be sped through fairly quickly, and if necessary they can even add extra parts as well. I'm really excited for next week. I think the episode after the next one could just be titled The Closing Chapter. 494 was called The Closing Chapter Part 1, but since Kubo never went back to that chapter title, I think they could just do that without the Part 1 on the end, but I guess we'll see. Regarding what else I think they could theoretically cut from next week, there is an entire chapter called Balancer's Justice, where they basically re-explain the history of the Quincy for readers who obviously don't really remember them, which I think was a very good idea, but I'm not sure we'll get the whole conversation this time, especially since a lot of Yuki's and Shino's scenes have been cut in general. That seems like something that they could really take away from if they have to. But like I said, I think the big fight with Kirige will serve us well. It's also going to be so crazy seeing Kirige's Volstendig, seeing him use Slave Ray on Aion. I can't wait for that, especially in all its uncensored glory. That's going to be so good to see. And so, at the end of this video, what's my verdict for Episode 2 Foundation Stones? Well, I really loved this episode. Now, I know I gave Episode 1 a 5 out of 5, but I confessed that I was basically giving it that because I was so excited that Bleach was back. Were I to look at that episode through a more critical lens, I think I would be better actually giving it a 4 out of 5. I still really did like it, but actually I think this episode is superior in many ways, and so for me, Episode 2 gets a 4.5 out of 5. Alright guys, but that's it for the video. Let me know in the comments below, did you like Episode 2? What was your favourite part of Episode 2? And who is your favourite character of the arc so far? I'm really happy with how Kirige Opie has been portrayed so far. He's basically exactly what I expected. But yeah, do let me know in the comments below your thoughts. Like I said at the start of the video as well, let me know how you feel about us only doing 2 anime videos a week, giving me room to do 2 of the kind of normal style of video that I do on this channel as well. Personally, I think it's better, a more even spread, but I'd like to get your feedback as well. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.